The sun hung low over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink as it dipped behind the jagged mountains. Dust swirled gently in the warm evening breeze, carrying the faint scent of sagebrush and sun-baked earth. On the weathered porch of a small ranch house, Caleb stood leaning against the wooden railing, his cowboy hat tilted slightly to shield his eyes from the dying light. His calloused hands rested on the rough-hewn wood, one thumb tracing the edge of his belt buckle, a silver piece engraved with a soaring eagle. Behind him, tied to a post, his horse, Ranger, snorted softly, shifting his weight as the day drew to a close. Beside Caleb stood Eliza, her hands cradling the swell of her belly, heavy with the child they'd been waiting for. Her dark hair was pulled back in a loose braid, strands escaping to frame her face, which was etched with a quiet worry. Her blue dress, practical yet feminine with its lace-trimmed apron, clung to her frame, the fabric stretched tight over her pregnancy. The porch creaked beneath their boots as they stood in silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on them like the heat of the midday sun. Caleb glanced at her, his hazel eyes softening. "You all right, darlin'?" he asked, his voice low and steady, the kind of voice that had calmed spooked horses and settled bar fights in the dusty saloons of his younger days. Eliza sighed, her fingers tightening on her belly. "I'm scared, Caleb," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's so close now. And with the drought, the ranch, I just don't know how we're gonna make it." Caleb turned to face her fully, removing his hat and running a hand through his dark, sweat-damp hair. He was a man of 35, hardened by years of wrangling cattle and breaking broncos, but the lines around his eyes deepened with her words. The ranch, tucked in a valley 30 miles from Tucson, had been in his family for 3 generations. But this year, the rains hadn't come. The creek that fed their pastures was a dry scar in the earth, and the cattle were thinning out, their ribs showing like shadows under their hides. "We'll make it," he said, stepping closer and resting a hand on her shoulder. "We always do. You, me, and this little one." He nodded toward her belly, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "God didn't bring us this far to let us fall now." Eliza managed a small smile, but her eyes were distant, fixed on the horizon where the last sliver of sun disappeared. "It's not just the ranch," she said. "It's everything. The bank's been sending letters. That man, Harlan, from Tucson, he's been sniffing around again, offering to buy us out. Says he'll pay double what this place is worth." Caleb's jaw tightened, and he spat into the dust off the porch. "Harlan's a vulture," he growled. "He's been waiting for folks like us to break so he can swoop in and turn this land into one of his cattle empires. Ain't no way I'm selling my granddaddy's ranch to a snake like him." Eliza turned to him, her eyes searching his face. "But what if we don't have a choice? The baby's coming any day now, and we barely have enough to feed ourselves, let alone a child. What if?" "No." Caleb's voice was firm, cutting her off. He took her hands in his grip strong but gentle. "We're not giving up. Not on this land, not on our family. I'll find a way, Eliza. I swear it." The next morning, Caleb was up before dawn, saddling Ranger under a sky still speckled with stars. He'd heard talk in town of a cattle drive up north, near Flagstaff, where the grass was still green and buyers were paying top dollar. It was a long shot, 3 weeks on the trail, with rustlers and storms to contend with, but it could be enough to pay off the bank and keep Harlan at bay. He kissed Eliza goodbye on the porch, her face pale in the early light. "You take care of yourself and our boy," he said, resting a hand on her belly. She'd been adamant it was a boy, though they wouldn't know until he arrived. "Or girl," she teased weakly, but her eyes were wet. "You come back to us, Caleb Monroe. You hear me?" "I hear you," he said, tipping his hat before swinging onto Ranger's back. The drive was grueling. Caleb joined a crew of 10 men, herding 200 head of cattle through canyons and across dry riverbeds. Dust coated his throat, and the sun beat down mercilessly, but he kept going, driven by the thought of Eliza and their unborn child. At night, around the campfire, he listened to the other cowboys talk of better days, of land that wasn't dying under their boots. Some had already sold out to men like Harlan. Caleb said nothing, just stared into the flames, his resolve hardening. Halfway through the drive, trouble found them. A band of rustlers hit the herd under cover of a moonless night, scattering cattle and firing shots into the air. Caleb grabbed his rifle and gave chase, his heart pounding as he rode hard through the darkness. One of the rustlers turned on him, and in the chaos, a bullet grazed Caleb's arm, tearing through his shirt and leaving a bloody streak. He fired back, dropping the man, but the herd was spooked, and half the cattle were gone by morning. The drive barely broke even. When Caleb returned to the ranch, his arm bandaged and his face gaunt, he found Eliza in labor. She'd been alone, save for old Marta, the midwife from town, who'd arrived just in time. Caleb dropped his gear and ran to her side, holding her hand as she screamed through the pain. Hours later, as the sun rose over the desert, their son was born, a tiny, squalling boy with Eliza's dark hair and Caleb's stubborn chin. They named him Samuel, after Caleb's grandfather. But joy was tempered by reality. The bank's deadline loomed, and Harlan's latest offer sat unopened on the table, taunting them. One evening, as Samuel slept in a cradle by the fire, Caleb and Eliza sat on the porch again. The desert was quiet, the sky a blanket of stars. Caleb held the letter from Harlan, his fingers trembling with rage. "We could fight him," Eliza said softly. "Take it to court. The land's ours, Caleb. It's been in your family since before Arizona was a state." Caleb shook his head. "Court takes money we ain't got. And time we don't have." Eliza reached for his hand. "Then we find another way. We always do." The next day, Caleb rode into Tucson, not to the bank or Harlan's office, but to the assay office. Years ago, his grandfather had told stories of gold in the hills behind the ranch. Fools talk, most said, but Caleb had nothing left to lose. He spent days searching, digging through rock and dirt, until one afternoon, his pickaxe struck something that glinted in the harsh sunlight. Gold. Not a fortune, but enough. He sold the claim to a reputable miner, paid off the bank, and sent Harlan packing with a few choice words. The ranch was safe. The creek might still be dry, and the cattle thin, but Caleb and Eliza had their home, their son, and a future they could fight for. As winter came, the first rain in 2 years fell softly over the valley. Caleb stood on the porch with Eliza, Samuel bundled in her arms, and watched the water soak into the thirsty earth. The desert was harsh, but it was theirs. And together, they'd make it bloom again.